teachers and academics have actively campaigned since the 70s for classes on empire to be taught and have been shut down, and they get excluded from the curriculum because they see it as problematic, and then it's going to create a generation of people that aren't proud to be British. But at the same time, how can you be proud of a country that you don't even know its own history?
Hello and welcome to Expulsion at 50. My name is Dola Vasani. My guest for this episode is Max Russel. We first connected back in 2020 when he was doing his master's at Bologna University in Italy. Recently, we met in person and I had the opportunity to hear more about his thesis entitled Enduring Empire, a case study of the Ugandan Asian Diaspora.
Was born and have grown up in London. My mother's actually German and my dad is British. Growing up, I grew up in North London in sort of a very multicultural environment, especially at school, just everything. And I think it's one of those things when you're brought up in that multicultural environment, you don't realize that the rest of the country or the rest of the world is not like that. I took it for granted, this privilege to speak with people and be friends with people that are from all different corners of the world and experience their cultures, and that I could go out in London as I got older as well and experience all these different things on my doorstep with ease. As I got older and sort of politically aware, right, I started to realize that not everyone shares that enjoyment of multiculturalism, or they see it as a threat. You know, people use the other as a scapegoat. What we have seen over the last 10 years, the attitudes towards migrants and refugees really made me angry, but also more inquisitive as to why people have this view. That's one of the driving forces behind my interest in history.
Okay, so let me just pause you there. So
yeah.
Which school did you go to?
I went to William Ellis high school, well, secondary school.
And where is that?
It's near Hampstead Heath. So yeah, it's near Gospel Oak in North London, yeah. And that's where I started studying history as a GCSE. And obviously it's part of the national curriculum. So you have sort of your basic topics that get covered. So the Second World War, the rise of Nazism in Germany, First World War. There was, of course, a huge gap, which is, of course, the British Empire. And that's something that I'll come back to later. But I think even then I realized it's like, why aren't we taught about this? This is British history. We're taught about the triumphs of overcoming fascists in the Second World War, or I guess the end of imperialism after the First World War. But we're never taught of why we had an empire in the first place, or what happened to the people, the millions of colonial citizens who also served in those wars. There's been this intrigue in me to understand why someone fears the other or hates the other and sees them as their problems, when so much of this country has been built on the backs of immigrants and refugees and colonial subjects.
You did it at what, GCSE level and at A level? And
yeah.
So what you're telling me is that at neither level did the subject of empire be covered.
The subjects that were covered were, sort of the world wars, and then at A level was stuff about sort of 17th century, 18th century British politics, sort of statesmen and stuff like that, but there's this big gap of the 19th and early 20th century that just gets completely ignored. And I don't think it's a coincidence, especially if you look at the governments that have been in place. But that's also a story that goes back even further. And something that I learned when I was doing research is that teachers and academics have actively campaigned since the 70s for classes on empire to be taught and have been shut down, and they get excluded from the curriculum because they see it as problematic, and then it's going to create a generation of people that aren't proud to be British. But at the same time, how can you be proud of a country that you don't even know its own history? More a problem is that compulsory education, secondary school and primary school, isn't addressing it, because that is something that everyone has to do, that there's also a set national curriculum for. If there's a national curriculum that is actively excluding the history of empire and colonialism, that's a major problem.
And has that changed since you were at school?
I think it has moved somewhat in terms of addressing multiculturalism and citizenship studies. So talking about sort of the makeup of Britain as a country and where people came from. I also know that sort of the Windrush generation has now started to be taught, at least. But I still think it's very surface level, and also refuses to really acknowledge the terrible, terrible things that Britain committed as part of empire. I mean, once you get to university, every university, of course, has its own history course. I went to Newcastle University to do a bachelor's degree in history. I guess it was there that then I decided to write my dissertation on the rise of far-right extremism in former East Germany after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And that's again where that interest in understanding hate and extremism and fear of the other played into what I wanted to address from an academic perspective. I'm more interested in understanding how everyday people experience life in different periods, because I think that is how we come to understand how we experience the modern day and our present day situation. Why political ideas become popular, why they become out of fashion, why certain groups of people are targeted, why human migration happens, which is obviously something that has been going on for the entirety of recorded history. But it seems that with every wave of sort of refugees or migrants, they're always seen as this sort of new scary thing, even though the world has always adapted and ultimately come to accommodate it. I found this course in Bologna called Global Cultures, which aimed to challenge the Eurocentrism of history, which I thought was a very interesting idea. And I think it did. It really looked at other countries in a different way. And so I did a module called Indian Ocean History, ended up reading an article about the role of South Asians in the Kenyan independence movement. Heard of Gandhi being in South Africa. And so you're sort of aware of some connection between South Asia and Africa. But I didn't know about Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania and the massive populations of South Asians that had been there. I read about the Expulsion and Idi Amin, and I hadn't ever seen the film The Last King of Scotland, which I think is how most people my age would probably know of Idi Amin. And so I kept doing more research, and I found it such a fascinating story. And again, it has that angle of using a scapegoat, the fear of the other. I was also interested in Britain's role in it. It's not simply an issue between Asians and indigenous Ugandan Africans. There was a colonial dimension to that caused this expulsion.
You talk about the colonial dimension of causing the expulsion, and I wonder what that means exactly.
as part of my research, I looked into all the academic work that I could that was written about the expulsion. And the majority of it focused on sort of Idi Amin and his persona and this crazy event that happened. But I then did find some that looked at the colonial history. The very history of Uganda. Uganda wasn't a country in its current form until it was created by the British in the 1890s as they sought to build a railroad to connect their East African colonies. And so as part of that, they used their system of indentured labor, which is basically another form of slavery. And it was normally young men who had no idea, couldn't even sometimes read the contract they were signing, and they had no idea where they were being sent. And lots of them ended up in East Africa building the Uganda Railway. It was Britain that then created the Protectorate of Uganda, established a racial hierarchy with white British colonizers at the top, controlling sort of the commanding heights of the economy. And then they actively put South Asians as middlemen, as small business owners, as traders, who were then above the indigenous Ugandans, who were only allowed to basically work on these plantations that South Asians run, or in menial tasks. From its very, very beginning, the Protectorate of Uganda was racialized and created to create animosity between South Asians and Africans. Uganda was designated an African country, is what they termed it. There were only a few sort of white people that really lived in Uganda, but they still controlled everything. But it was visibly the South Asians that indigenous African Ugandans interacted with, because they were a visible other and the visible opponent. The South Asians were themselves colonized, but they were actively implementing colonialism in Uganda. In my research, found that in education in the schools in Uganda, for the indigenous Ugandans, the British teachers actively they had textbooks, and their history books taught that South Asians were the biggest offenders of the slave trade, of the African slave trade. So obviously not the Atlantic slave trade, but the slave trade that was involved like Arabs and the Middle East, and that South Asians were heavily involved in, but they kind of put the blame just on them, and said that, look, these South Asian people enslaved you and now are controlling your economy and continue to, they characterized them in a very stereotyping way, and said that, all they care about is money. And I mean, this is something that we've heard of before, and with Jewish people in Europe. And I think it's one of the reasons also East African Asians are often called sort of the Jews of Africa, which is it's an interesting term. But in terms of how they were scapegoated, I think there are definitely similarities of painting a minority that had economic success as sort of greedy and villainous. So yeah, I think in terms of that apartheid thing, the British colonial government was actively creating hostilities that all came to fruition then as independence approached, because they were then able to remove themselves from the dimension and leave Uganda as a country that had a majority of indigenous people, but a very wealthy and successful South Asian middle class that was still there.
And what did you find out, Max, in terms of the town planning and how that was all getting played out in terms of apartheid?
The urban planning of towns and cities in Uganda, the government actively divided spaces between what South Asians could own and where they could live and where Africans could live. As I said, there weren't as many European settlers, but the very best land was reserved for white people. Then the majority of good land was given to South Asians, who created sort of cotton plantations or sugar plantations. And then the indigenous people were basically left with nothing to work with.
So what was basically happening, which is very similar to what happened in apartheid South Africa, is that you had zoning. So, the hills and the suburbs were tree-lined and occupied by white people. And the Indians were in the city center. So often they were living above the shops. And the black people were coming into the city to work, but 6 o'clock they went and they lived outside in the townships.
Exactly, that sort of zoning and that removal of white people to the suburbs and the hill. And yeah, I've read about sort of the hills of Kampala, right? And those being these exclusive places. And that again was something that they were never even interacting with South Asians or the indigenous Africans. So although you was kind of a British protectorate, you never saw these white people that controlled everything. Who you saw were the South Asians who ran the shops.
What was your hypothesis for your thesis, for your MA?
My hypothesis was to show that although the British Empire has formally ended, the influence of colonialism, of empire, of imperialism continues to influence our society to this day. And when I say our society, I don't just mean Britain, but I also mean the former colonies. You can call it the shadow of empire, the ghost of empire, and how it continues to influence economic aspects, political aspects of what we discuss in Britain, but also what gets discussed in countries like Uganda. Especially in the case of the Ugandan Asian Diaspora, Britain has been influential in that history from its very inception, from the movement of South Asians from the British Raj to East Africa under the system of indentured labor, to then creating them in this middleman status, to allowing them to have sugar plantations, setting up that economy, actively teaching indigenous Africans that they were predatory, to then leaving the country as independence happened, then also continuing to play a role in choosing the leaders. So Milton Obote, the first long-term president, was supported by Britain and the West until he decided to address the European control of big businesses and banks in the country. And when that happened in 1969, Britain realized that he was no longer useful to them and began planning a coup to replace him with Idi Amin. So that is a classic example of how Uganda had achieved independence in 1962. Their fates, their political fates, the country's economy was still being decided by external forces. And, Idi Amin came into power and Britain then eventually didn't back him. At every stage, Britain is playing a role, whether it's the forefront or in the background. And I think that's the thing for me, is that we kind of think that empire and colonialism has ended, but its effects and its consequences haven't. The Cold War is, of course, mainly this conflict between the US and the USSR through proxy wars and proxy coups and balances of power. But Britain was still heavily involved, especially in countries where they had been part of their empire. They had a big interest in it. I think in Uganda was a real case of that. They didn't want to give up on their economic exploits that they continue to take through the country through banks and industries like that. Countries in Africa sort of moved from independence from what you could say were the old superpowers, right? Britain and France and Portugal, into this new conflict where then they were being targeted by the US and the USSR for support. Yeah, they were using them as proxy proxy states to conduct balances of power over. And again, it's the ordinary people that ended up suffering it.
What you're talking about with your hypothesis is the role of that invisible hand.
Maybe the role of the Cold War and sort of the US and the USSR fighting for influence over countries has reduced less. You now have China as well, and there's always external influences, and as you said, this sort of invisible hand. So I think these countries are so connected with the West and its role in deciding the financial planning and the political planning of those countries that they're never really truly independent. You will see countries that try to move towards that independence, and there are still, coups that are backed by the West, by certain powers, and you see conflict between Idi Amin and the South Asians and telling them that they have to leave. But behind that, there were so many other forces going on at play. There was the British government that was trying to actively deny those British passport holders, South Asians who had British passports because they were colonial citizens, the ability to resettle in the United Kingdom, because they knew it would create more racial tensions here because of the attitude towards coloured immigration.
Let's talk a little bit about, as Max, what would you say were like 2 or 3 of the main kind of light bulb moments for you when you were doing your MA, and particularly on your thesis?
Maybe the overarching thing is that there are so many communities in this country that we don't know the story of. And the Ugandan Asians are just one of them. There are so many different communities that have experienced such a long intertwined history with this country. And it really is, to me, it's to understand why they are here, right? And how they ended up here. I think that was definitely one of them. Another was to see how the media portrays different refugees and different citizens. And that's something I also looked at. And so when the expulsion was happening in 1972, the media attention was on how many were arriving, and the numbers were highly inflated, and that they would not settle in, that their culture was too different. But then interestingly, as they arrived and did settle in and became very involved in life in the UK, and especially economic aspects, that's often the narrative that is painted, is that the Ugandan Asians are this sort of success story of economic success in cities like Leicester. They were then used in the 80s by sort of Thatcher's supporters to show that, look, these refugees came here, we didn't really help them when they arrived, and look at it, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and have achieved economic success. So they were almost used as this perfect minority to justify not providing social support to immigrants and refugees.
Okay, so let's move the conversation on, and let's hear about what you're doing now at Faith Matters, and particularly around the project that you're working on of documenting oral history.
Yeah, so I'm currently working as a social researcher on a oral history project, which is entitled From East to West, The History of Ugandan Asians. And so this project was the idea of Fayaz Mughal, who himself is a Ugandan Asian. He is the CEO and founder of Faith Matters, a charity that tackles Islamophobia and extremism, and aims to sort of promote integration and cohesion while tackling hate crimes. this year, of course, is the 50th anniversary of the Ugandan Asian expulsion. It is important that we document these stories of the experiences, the lived experience of Ugandan Asians who went through that expulsion, specifically with a focus on resettlement in the United Kingdom. Over the next year, we are looking to work with members of the Ugandan Asian community to document their lived experiences through oral history. And so how that works is we offer anyone that experienced the expulsion to be interviewed and talk about their story. But at the same time, we're also training younger members of the Ugandan Asian community who didn't experience the expulsion in how to record oral history. So we are offering them training to understand the ethics, the technicalities of documenting histories and oral histories. And so I think it will not only be a reflective experience for those that get interviewed, but also for those that are conducting the interviews, because I've talked to lots of young people, second, third, fourth generation Ugandan Asians, that don't really know that much even about their own history. That's a real problem as well. I mean, the aim of the project is really to make this history known to as many people as possible, but it's also about giving back to the community. We want to make sure that those stories and those interviews are preserved. So we transcribe them and we're archiving them. And so they will be available indefinitely for the wider general audience and for people to reflect on. Personal stories and oral history is so important in that sense because everyone has experienced something different. So it will be recorded and then it will be transcribed as well. So it allows people to read it.
When you say young people, have you got like an age range?
It's really open to anyone that didn't experience the expulsion directly. So but we've had a great age range from people, as young as 18 to people in their 40s. Some of them I've talked to, they say exactly the same thing. They're like, I only really became aware of my own history a few years ago. What I've also heard is that lots of people, their parents or their grandparents sort of passed away without ever really that information being recorded. It kind of gets told in anecdotes or fragments, but you never really get the full picture. It's not just about commemorating the expulsion. It's about helping those untold stories get heard.
And I think it's also about just getting people excited about something that, has happened in their family. And then through that, hopefully they get curious about the bigger picture. Thank you for listening to this fascinating account from Max. You can find out more about the project on ugandanasians.com. Till next time, keep well and keep safe.